This video is actually a tag whose creator I'm unaware of. The gist is that you talk about 10 books that stayed with you in some way or another. So prepare, this is going to get as sentimental as this channel has ever been. I wasn't sure what video I wanted to make this week. This prompt felt like an opportunity to just speak from the heart instead of trying to be funny or creative or interesting. As a kid, I grew up on Percy Jackson and the Olympians and the Heroes of Olympus. It was lively and fresh, and the books were still coming out, and I remember begging my parents to buy them for me. I was so enamored by this mystical world where everyday problems didn't exist. It was just this faceless evil that could and would be defeated in the end. And I suppose that's a draw of a lot of fantasy, especially for children. It was the first book series I ever wrote cringe fanfiction for. Yes, I've deleted all of it, do not ask about it. The first book crushes I had, and the first real community I was part of online, although I was really too young to be online. It started so much of what I do and am today that even though the books don't hold up for me at all when I try to go back and read them, I just can't let go of its special place in my heart. Not to mention that it gave really strong voices, at least in my 10-year-old eyes, to girls and queer people and people of color, and having that influence was so important in my childhood growing up in a very conservative, backwards, Christian white area. And I don't think Percy Jackson is some Sebastian of diversity. I honestly don't remember next to anything about it at this point, and I know it's had some controversies about diversity in particular, but to me it was an entirely different world from the red state echo chamber that I was living in. Without the things that Percy Jackson and my time engaging with the fandom taught me, I could have become a very hateful human being. Well, I would have become a different type of hateful. I do in fact hate everything and everyone. Prejudiced. Let's say I could have become prejudiced. Throughout middle school, the thing that kept me was Full Dark, No Stars by Stephen King, or specifically the short story 1922. It was this perfect storm of parentification and small towns and farms and nostalgia that really struck me, and I think it's the first Stephen King book I ever read, so it also started me down a long path of consuming his novels, which are some of my favorites to this day. Like the next one, Pet Sematary, also by Stephen King. I read this one in freshman year of high school, and I still remember how the pages looked under the awful school lighting. The same way I can still remember the day I got The House of Hades by Rick Riordan after school, and I just sat on the living room floor and read for hours. And it was artful the way that King portrayed Lewis's slow descent into madness. It's the kind of book and the kind of character work that makes the reader inspired. It made me want to write, and it made me want to make something that could make people feel the same way this book made me feel. And not only was it just technically amazing, but I was very alone at that time in my life, and all of the grief and loss and guilt in the novel spoke to me in a profound way. Judd was such a comforting character with such a grandfatherly presence, and all of the characters really were so familiar to me that it made the story that much harder and better to get through. I'd say, well, it's not perfect, but honestly, it kind of is to me. The Haunting of Hill House is another book I read in that time in my life, and the themes of depression and illness were just so raw. It's the kind of story that comes from the heart, that unique taste of bitter loneliness that infuses everything in your life when you've been isolated for so long. I still feel that strong bond with Eleanor. I still relate to her on such a primal level. That need to get away, the way the past haunts you. It's so beautifully woven into her character, and my only criticism is that I want more of it in the story. I want less story, and I want more Eleanor. I can still remember the passages about her mom banging her cane on the wall, and the whimsical, almost dreamlike fantasies she made up on the way to Hill House about the gargoyles and the cup of stars. And the writing itself is gorgeous, which definitely plays a factor in remembering it so well. Jackson has some of my favorite prose ever. I think there's a reason she's considered one of the best writers in American literature, which brings me to a bit of a weird book in that I've been searching for this thing for years and I have not been able to come up with the title or the author, but I distinctly remember the way I loved it. So if I put Lost Media in the title, it's not clickbait. It was a gothic novel, I want to say published in the late 1800s to potentially the 1920s. We followed this man who was painting a portrait of a woman named Alice, and Alice is just a mess. She's chaotic. She's the classic whimsical female love interest of a gothic novel. Also, her family is inbred, and I don't know why I remember that detail. Something about the family portraits was strange to the narrator, and I guess that's why I remember it. But he slowly falls in love with Alice, which is an issue because she is married, although she doesn't really care for him and doesn't really give give him the time of day. And at the end, she ends up killing the main character. This novel sticks out to me more for the mystery than anything. The only real clue I have to go on is that I read it on archive.org, but it was such a fun book and I really enjoyed it. I've gone through every possible book I can think of. I've tried searching gothic novel and similar things on archive.org's book section because I figure that's what I was searching at the time. I've asked online and I just cannot find this thing. The next book is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Time for some lore. For a short time, I had a little book blog and it was very short-lived, but one of my first reviews was Jurassic Park. I just wanted to be a reader again. I realized I'd lost that magic I used to find when I was in school, and Jurassic Park was the first novel I blew through without a problem, which is a far cry from the 20 books a month I used to be capable of as a kid, but it was definitely unusual for me at that point. And while a lot of why it stuck with me comes down to it suits my tastes in dinosaur fiction perfectly, I also read it at a time where I was between the endings of childhood narcissism and the beginnings of emotional maturity. It was the first book that was loudly commenting on society that I ever read, and it was also such a different reading experience than what the movies prepared me for. There is a lesson in and of itself in the differences between the movies and the books. Of course, after that I'd go on to read 1984 and Animal Farm and The Great Gatsby and all these other rather heavy-handed social commentaries, but Jurassic Park still sticks out to me as the one that started my interest in the genre and the one that showed me, oh, a book can be like that. Another book that's special to me is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I read this one in particular with a literature class that was also very special to me because it was the first English class I ever really enjoyed. I've always had a lot of gripes about education being very unfair to neurodivergent people, and English classes in particular are some of the worst offenders. So hey, Mr. Fawcett, if you somehow find this video, because I know you watch book content on YouTube, you're a great guy. Back to Jekyll and Hyde, the themes of duality really spoke to me. I've talked before on this channel about having bipolar depression, and I think that's part of why the story and those themes really speak to me in particular. I know all too well the feeling of being two separate people, especially when it comes to being your normal self and being the version of you that's struggling with an addiction. In my case, it wasn't addiction outright, thankfully, but the thought patterns of being in an abusive relationship are very similar, and so interpreting the story in that way still spoke to me. Similar to that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I read for the same class. The funny thing about this book is that I actually kind of dislike it. I hate Frankenstein, the main character, and I think he's pathetic. As per usual, my solace was the messed up little guy made out of random body parts from the cemetery. Again, the creature was just a character that spoke to my feelings of isolation and misunderstanding and loneliness. My heart broke over and over for this creature that I saw myself in, and I felt a connection that I don't always feel with characters. And of course the disses at religion were cool too. I hated most of the rest of the book except for the prose. Mary Shelley's prose was quite nice and sometimes very beautiful, especially when she was writing about the creature and their feelings. A bit lighter, Proust and the Squid by Marianne Wolfe is a non-fiction book, unlike any of the others on this list, about the development of human language and the commingling of education with language learning from a psychological perspective. I'm someone who has always believed that literature and literacy are vital parts of being human and being intelligent, and are crucial for people being able to navigate themselves and their lives and to find meaning. And this book reinforced those feelings and gave me solid reasons to support them. I felt very lost and confused about where I wanted to go in my life. I was questioning the plans I had made, and I didn't know if I really knew what I wanted to do. And this book reminded me of the dreams I've always had of being a psychologist, and most importantly, of being someone who can use my privileges and my disadvantages in order to make a meaningful change in someone else's life. And then I read Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, so that's a bit of a derail. I think it's a very beautifully written novel about a disgusting piece of human trash. It is raw in that it does not try to hide that its main character is trash. It's quite difficult to read, and I think that's the main reason it stuck with me, is that it's so realistic and so hard to get through because of it. It's depraved, and I think that's fantastic. Not because it's fun, but because, to put it as simply as I can, I think the root of solving issues begins in understanding them. And having pieces of literature like that is a very important step in a cultural understanding of why people do depraved things, which is a very important step, in my opinion, in cultivating a society where the root causes of such behavior can be identified and eliminated, as well as where the early indicators of that potential path can be identified much easier and can be quickly rerouted into a productive or less destructive path. Understanding evil, to use a word I quite dislike in moral discussions, is stopping evil. And unfortunately, again, the prose is just so beautiful. Before we go, I feel that an honorable mention is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, mainly because of its beautiful prose, which I have certainly tried to emulate in my own writing, and I identify quite a bit with the philosophy of it. It's probably tied with Lolita in reality, but it's cleaner to have 10 instead of 11. Maybe you have some new things to check out now if you read. I've been contemplating a bit more recently. I'm having all these scary new adult thoughts that one usually has at that time, so it's a bit comforting to turn around and look back on my life like this. If you have big boy things like a disposable income, then feel free to hop on over to my stores. I sell handmade things and thrifted things and custom things and all kinds of things. You can find those on my social media linked in the description below. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. And thank you for 400 subscribers. I recently hit that, and that's really cool. Bye bye.